Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranavardi, board member for ColumbiaDC and a graduate of School of Engineering and Applied Science. We are very privileged and honored to have Joseph L. Graves, Jr., professor of biological science at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, and Alan H. Goodman, professor of biological anthropology at Hampshire College, to talk about racism, not race, and answer to frequently asked questions about this topic, which is the topic of their most recent book published by Columbia University Press. I would encourage everyone to check our website for the link to the book. If you would like to purchase, the link is there. Also to check full bio and complete list of works by Professor Graves and Goodman, but please allow me to briefly introduce them before we start our presentation. Joseph L. Graves, Jr. is a professor in the Department of Biology at North Carolina A&T State University. He is a fellow of the Council of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. His books include The Emperor's New Clothes, Biological Theories of Race at the Millennium, published in 2001, and The Race Myth, Why We Pretend Race Exists in America, published in 2005. Alan H. Goodman is a professor of biological anthropology at Hampshire College and a former vice president for academic affairs. He is a past president of the American Anthropological Association and co-directs its public education project on race. He's a co-author of Race, Are We So Different, which came with the second edition in 2019, among other books. So without further ado, Professor Graves, Professor Goodman, floor is all yours.
Well, thank you for having us tonight. And I think you have some slides you want to advance for us.
Absolutely.
So the title of our book, Racism, Not Race, Answers to Frequently Asked Questions. We've been asked why this title, and to make a long story short, we chose this title because we wanted to get across to our readers that it was racism that came up with the social definition of race. And I'm going to explain how social definitions of race are different from biological definitions of race in a few seconds. So can we have the next slide, please? So the purpose of the book was to provide a concise and accessible set of answers to questions about race and racism. These questions were gathered from 30 plus years for each of us, gathering questions from students, educators, policymakers, friends, and family. We particularly wrote this for readers who want to work towards human equity and for readers who were nervous about saying the wrong thing. And in many cases, these two groups overlap. Next slide, please. The book is broken into chapters. Chapter 1, of course, setting the table, giving definitions of what race, racism, and human biological variation are. Chapter 2, how did race come to be and why is it still so important? Chapter 3, everything you wanted to know about genetics and race. Chapter 4, everything you might want to know about racism. Chapter 5, why do races differ in disease incidence? Chapter 6, life history, aging, and mortality. Next slide, please. 7, athletics, bodies, and abilities. 8, races, brains, and behaviors. Chapter 9, driving while black. Could we go back a slide, please? Thank you. Chapter 10, DNA and ancestry testing. 11, race names and race mixing. In chapter 12, we present our view of what a world without racism would look like and how we can get there. Finally, in the conclusion, we summarize what has been learned by reading the text. Next, please. So this gives an example of the types of questions that we offer and the answers, of course, that go to them. So chapter 1, we ask the question, did the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans have a concept of race? What changed in Spain in 1492? what led to the idea of biological race, and so on. Next slide, please. Chapter 7, which is one of the chapters in which we deal in specific sets of misconceptions about race, particularly one of the most pernicious ones. What is intelligence? Do races differ in their cognitive abilities and intelligence? Is there a genetic basis for intelligence? And so on. Next, please. Now, I started by making the point that there are two different race concepts. And you will often hear people say race is not a scientific concept. And that's something that neither Alan or I have ever said, because we understand that there are race concepts and their definitions and their purpose are quite different. So the biological race concept has a history. And what most people don't recognize is that its early history really is derived from Christian theology and not biology as one would think of it in the 20th century or the 21st century. And these early concepts had to do with what an individual looked like and what portion of the world they inhabited. But these concepts don't really become popular until the age of European discovery and colonialism. In the 20th century, biological conceptions of race begin to be based on populations and the frequency of genes, and this was made possible by the neo-Darwinian synthesis, which occurred in the early portion of the 20th century. And later on in the 20th century, ideas of identifying biological races have to do with whether a population or group of individuals within a species can be considered a unique evolutionary lineage. Now, this concept is dramatically different from that of socially constructed or socially defined race. And this arbitrarily utilizes aspects of morphology, geography, culture, language, religion, but only does so in the service of a social dominance hierarchy. In other words, it was racism that invented socially defined race. It did not result from an objective examination of human biological diversity and the need to classify people into biological groups. And as such, the socially defined race concept is historically and culturally contextual. Next slide.
Okay, I think that's me.
That's you, Alan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. So I'm going to do the middle section, and here I want to get through three main ideas, and these come out in chapter 1 of the book with Dr. Graves. First one is I want to be very, very clear that what Joe and I are saying is not that human variation doesn't exist. We both are interested in human variation. I study it as a biological anthropologist. It's obvious, as in the differences you can see here between the athletes Willie Schumacher and Wilt Chamberlain. It's real, it's obvious, it's wonderful, it's what drives evolution. Next, please. But, and this is the big but, race as biology in red is a myth. It doesn't explain or describe human variation. So we have the difference between a reality and an idea. Next slide, please. And finally, we cut off a little bit from the top, but educating about the myth of race is, I think, necessary to eliminate racism. We need to know what race is and what isn't. So I'm going to go through, next slide, please, a little bit about why race is not biologically real, but is culturally real, as is racism. So a little bit of thinking, imagination here. Imagine that there are 3 biological races. We can attribute them to the old types, Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid, the old racial tropes or ideas or labels, or African, European, Asian. Next slide, please. Now, the question we really want to ask genetically is how much overlap there is between the three groups. You know, are they really discrete and separable genetically as different groups of people, genetically distinct, or is there a lot of overlap between them? So this is a model suggesting that they're pretty discrete, that, you know, Asians in the green circle, Europeans in red, Africans in purplish, that there's little overlap, and the little individuals in there, you could think about the amount of amount of space between them is really kind of conceptually the amount of genetic difference between them. So, okay, if you get it, this is little genetic overlap. Next, thank you. This is an example of some genetic overlap between the three groups. And finally, next slide, please. This is a model where there's lots of overlap and they don't seem to be, you know, hold much water. Race doesn't seem to explain much variation. Next slide, please. So the question is, which model actually correctly describes contemporary human variation? The first model, no overlap, some overlap, lots of overlap. And I've done this before and we've had votes, but you can keep your, think about what model you think is correct, but we're not going to tally votes or anything like that. Next slide, please. So if you did vote for number one, well, if you were, say, alive 150 years ago, almost everybody would have voted for number one, because at that point, it's a typological view of race, and they're really seen as maybe even different species. They're created by God, pre-Adamites, and very, very distinct. And unfortunately, a few people still think this way, but that's categorically not true. Wrong. Doesn't describe human variation. Next slide, please. Yeah, this model sometimes I'd call a phenotypic or skin color view of race. Lots of people think this is true, that it seems to be what we see, that we can try to sort people as we look at them into different races. But again, this slide doesn't describe genetic variation within and among races. Next slide, please. Sorry that this didn't come through. This is the slide with the great overlap between the three groups and didn't translate properly. But this slide is actually based on, or this model, if you can remember it, is based on actual genetic data collected by Richard Lewontin in 1972, 50 years ago exactly, replicated a lot of times. And what Lewontin finds is that 94% of variation occurs within each continent and only about 6% between continents. But there's something missing in this slide. And so I want to show you on the next slide, hopefully that comes through. Sorry that this one didn't make it through either. If you can imagine what this slide is, it's of three circles like you've seen previously, but here the African circle basically encompasses the European and Asian circle. The African circle is much bigger. So in a sense, the Europeans and Asians are a genetic subset of Africans. And what's great about that, or what's really interesting about that, is it affirms what we sort of knew archaeologically, paleontologically, is affirmed by genetics, is that we were Africans for roughly 200,000 years before the first humans went outside of Africa and colonized Europe, Asia, the rest of the world. And those individuals that did only took a little bit of the African variation. So one of the results of this is that genetic variation between two Africans on average is greater than the genetic variation between an African and a European or Asian. Let me repeat that. Genetic variation between two Africans in general on average is greater than the genetic variation between an African and a European. So next slide, please. So really a model of human diversity of variation instead of having three separate circles, is really something like nested Russian dolls, with the larger doll being the Africans and everybody else fitting within the African doll. So when it comes to race, biologically, there's no there. Next slide, please. So next and next and next, we'll just do this complete slide. If you can forward a second. Nice thing is up on the, you can see the actual model that I was referring to last time, with the purple blue being the African genetic diversity, and then the European and Asian fitting within that diversity. That's the correct model. On the other side is the incorrect model of human biological variation. And why this model, why race doesn't hold water? It's for three different reasons. Theoretically, evolutionary processes, not race, explain how variation comes about. The data, as I've just explained a little bit of, is variation is much greater, is little among races or between races, and is mainly within races, and is explained by geographic location, not race. And next, please. And finally, when it comes to actual practice, race is a garbage concept because it can't be defined. And Science 101 is any kind of, classificatory device. You have to be able to repeatedly define it. Next slide, please. So that's why race doesn't equal human variation. As I said, human variation is real. Next slide. So why is this so important to Joe and I? Well, as Joe said, racism is sort of the father of race, but now biological race does work, and it gives sort of ideological cover for racism. And in some sense, it's like taking a gun away from those who hope to do harm. I mean, they may do harm, but at least they don't have a weapon, an ideological weapon to do harm. Next slide, please. So next. So I just want to give you, shifting from race to racism, one of the important points is that if we know that biological race is a myth, then we have to stop equating all differences, all inequalities we see to some made up genetic difference. And so I just want to point to two of them that have been persistent and have are myths that we tackle in the book that are race myths that come off of the big myth of biological race being real. One is the idea that there's some inherent difference in infant mortality, also low birth weight between Black versus white babies. The truth is, in the United States, Black babies die at a rate that's something like 2.2 times greater than that of white babies. Unconscionable fact. And knowing that is quite clear that that has to be due to lived experience, including systemic racism, rather than biology. Next slide, please. Next. The same goes for incarceration rates. I mean, we're thinking about violence and criminality as somehow connected to propensities and things of that sort. Rate of incarceration of African Americans, 6 times that of European Americans. US has the largest incarcerated population in the world. Michelle Alexander said more Blacks have been incarcerated than were slaves. This is unconscionable, has nothing at all to do with biology or race, but has a lot to do with racism. Next slide, please. So biological race should be dead, should be a dead science, should be put on the scrap heap of dead scientific ideas. I hope everybody can go away with that. And what's important about it is it both is bad science and bad social justice, and keeping that idea alive in the smog of thought inhibits both science and social justice. Next slide, please. Okay.
And so in the final chapter, we discussed our vision of what a world without racism would look like. And it starts with a quote such as this one. In much of the Democratic Party, it's now fashionable to say that America is racist. That is a lie. America is not a racist nation or a racist country. And that was a quote from Nikki Haley, who was former ambassador to the United Nations at the Republican National Convention in August of 2020. Now, she was born Nimrata Nikki Randhawa, the daughter of Sikh parents who immigrated to the United States from Punjabi, India. And in fact, in that same speech, she talked about many of the racist things that her parents had to put up with to be able to make it in the United States, which would sort of support the idea that, in fact, there is a great deal of racism in the United States. Next slide. And we can contrast her to the Democratic Vice President, Kamala Harris, whose mother was also an Indian American. And aside from their mothers and that they both went into politics, the similarities seem to end there. Harris's mother married a man of African descent who was from Jamaica, and she strongly identifies with her African heritage and attended Howard University. And I'm sure all of you are aware, or most of you should be aware, that yesterday, many of the nation's historically Black institutions were once again threatened with bombs. Luckily, my institution was not, but my fear, and in fact, I wrote such today, that given the atmosphere that is developing this country, these threats are soon going to turn into actual terror attacks against people of color and their institutions. Next slide, please. So, and this in part is driven by the fact that white supremacy was apparent in the storm of the Capitol in January of 2021. Now, we were writing much of Racism, Not Race before George Floyd's murder. And we also wrote the conclusion afterwards, but before the election of 2020. And one of the fears that we both had at that time is that the president, Donald Trump, would attempt to retain his position in the White House despite the results of the election. I think now it is very clear to people who've been paying attention that is precisely what he planned to do, and that without the actions of a few individuals, he might have in fact gotten away with it. Next, please. So we wrote Racism, Not Race to be a tool, particularly to help people who are consistently attempting to address social justice issues, but often don't have the knowledge or background to be able to argue against the consistent racist and racial misconceptions that they encounter in their daily lives. We hope that we have accomplished that. And certainly we're willing and hope that you have questions about what we've done and how the book works. So at this point, we thank you for your attention and we're willing to take your questions.
Great, thank you both so much. I'm just going to get my video started here. All right. Okay, thank you. My name is Miyako Yerrick, and I am the admin for the ColumbiaDC alumni group. We do have some questions coming in. I just want to remind everyone to please use the Q&A box and not the chat function. It's just a little bit easier for me to control. So if we can put questions into the Q&A box, I will go from there for both of our lovely speakers today. So our first one that came in literally 3 minutes into our talk, which I'm sure you probably could have guessed was going to come up. So we're just going to start with it, get it out of the way, is your thoughts on the Whoopi Goldberg suspension.
Well, I'll start if it's okay with you, Joe.
Yeah, go ahead, Al.
I don't have any real thoughts about whether or not the suspension is just or not. But yeah, I do think in her trying to walk back, which she said, she's missed some important lessons for all of us. First, to say that we all breathe a certain racial smog, and in the US context, race is really mostly about color. And that's, I think, what Whoopi was reflecting. But she missed a lot. She certainly missed the fact that this was not man's inhumanity to man. It was a garden variety man. It was not white on white, but in fact that Jews were racialized in Nazi Germany. Not just that, but that was not a unique thing. Jews had pretty much always been racialized, at least up to World War II. And then they got led into the club of whiteness. And, most Jews who are Ashkenazi became white folks. So she entirely missed that non-US context of race. I think the most important thing she missed is that race, as she seemed to think about it, as skin color, as we've said in the book, as a main message of the book, that in fact is a social construct. That's not real. And Whoopi seems to think that there's maybe something primordial, natural about how in 2000, in this year we're in, we divide people up in the United States. And so I hope she does her homework and learns a little bit. I was surprised that she didn't know that or seems not to know that. And yeah, so Joe, you want to add to that?
I agree with you, Alan. I actually didn't hear her comments, but I saw a discussion on CNN this morning. And again, one of the reasons we wrote this book is that even well-meaning people are confused about biological and social conceptions of race and the history of racism and racialization across the world. So, and Whoopi is one of those people.
Well, I am seeing some questions come in, and I think, we are Columbia alumni here, and we advertise with a lot of other alumni groups from very high-level institutions, but we are getting questions that I think show people have questions and they don't quite understand this topic. So even some of our alumni, I think, have some good questions. So we'll continue on. We have Lynn Miller, who said that she is Caucasian and did the 23andMe genetic test and found a small percentage of African DNA, small being like 3% or less, so quite small. So she says, how does the small amount of race crossover relate to the finding that there is more heterogeneity among races than between them?
Okay, Alan, if you don't mind me taking this one.
So
the first thing that people need to understand is that 99.9% of the human genome is shared by all humans. Now, with 3.3 billion base pairs, that means that 0.1 that's left is not a small amount of base pairs. It's on the order of 300 million. So it gives you the opportunity to be unique individuals. So, people are unique except for identical twins. And there is also genetic variation, which is apportioned by the migration of humans across the world in different regions. Now, what most people don't realize is that and we talk about this in chapter 9, when DNA testing is done, they're really looking at non-coding portions of the human genome. And these portions of the human genome, because they don't make any proteins, can accumulate mutations, and they'll differ in genetic frequency by random chance, which we call genetic drift. And so, when we talk about, people being, and I don't know what the percentages were, it's really resulting from this recent mutations that occurred in different regions of the world. And so if someone, score says that they have 3% African ancestry, if you go back each generation, your ancestry goes half, a quarter, an eighth, and so forth, then one of those persons was a person of African descent, okay, or what we would call an African today. And that's entirely possible, okay? Now, the other thing you need to recognize is that the degree to which these tests accurately tell you your ancestry differs depending upon which populations are being mentioned. And so for places where populations have been in the same place for a long period of time, where population size has been large, where there's been relatively little migration there, they're more accurate than places in which, there's been population fluctuation, there's been movement, and so forth. So any DNA ancestry test you take, you really should take with a couple of grains of salt. I don't know if I answered the question or not.
Well, I'm sure they will let us know if you didn't.
Yeah, I just add, I think, Joe, you that was a really nice explanation. And as Joe says, with a grain of salt, 3% is probably pretty close to 0 to be within the range of variation. And people who have done repeat tests or have done tests by different DNA ancestry groups have gotten wildly different results because they're based on different populations, they have different algorithms, and none of this is the absolute truth. And the final thing I'll say is that it's based on a world in which everybody stays in one place, and that's simply not true. We're a species that's highly mobile and has kept moving throughout the world.
Great. Okay, we have a question about your Venn diagrams. So Jacinta asks, what quantity is being referenced with the Venn diagrams? So what quantity is equal or common when they intersect? So are there truly no genetic variations that occur in Europeans that can't be found in Africans to support the claim that Europeans are a subset of African genetic variation?
Yeah, I mean, the Venn diagrams were, I can try to maybe link later on, were developed. There's an initial paper that was published for which the data were derived, and then the Venn diagrams were done by a geneticist, Jeff Long, through a program. There is there's a small amount of unique variation in Asia and Africa. Some of that is Neanderthal admixture, and a little bit of it is the development of new variants. And for instance, skin color genes that Joe can speak to a little bit are one of the surprisingly small new variants that have been introduced into populations that migrated out of Africa. So did that answer the question? I'm not sure I got everything that the question.
Yeah, and let me add to that. I mean, there certainly are genetic variants that are found only in specific regions of the world, such as Europe, in Central Asia, in East Asia, in the Pacific Islands. However, the vast majority of human genetic variation occurs on the continent of Africa. And so while there are genetic variants, and again, some of these have to do with selection, they don't particularly cluster into the groups that we would, identify as socially defined races. So for example, if we take anti-malarial adaptations, they're found wherever malaria is transmitted. So they're found in tropical Africa, but they're also found in the Mediterranean. They're also found in Southern Europe. They're also found in the Saudi Peninsula. They're also found in India. They're also found in Thailand. And so the relevant thing is the transmission of malaria and genetic variants which resist it. And there are other examples, such as altitude adaptation. There's altitude adaptation in the Himalayan plateau, which probably originated in Denisovan humans. And there's altitude variation in the Andes, which is derived from altitude adaptation that occurred in, Eastern, Asia, but isn't the ones that came from the Denisovans. So if we keep looking at the small number of traits, and that's the thing, that we show in everything you wanted to know about genetics and race, that chapter, we show that the amount of genetic adaptation that occurred during the human migration around the world is amazingly small. And it deals with a couple of major themes like disease resistance, altitude, diet, Arctic adaptation, but it's none of the stuff that plays into complex traits like intelligence and behavior. And they're usually single gene traits, not, multigenic adaptation that differs between populations. So yes, there are some SNPs that are found uniquely in Europe and but that's not the story. It's not the story at all.
Okay, we have a few questions about the validity of the census, kind of using descriptors of race. And so one person says, should we continue to use these descriptors to guide social policy, or should we use a different classification system, if any? Somebody else notes, like, obviously they're filling out the census and they have to mark these. And then somebody else, how does ethnicity play into this? Are there different genotypes or phenotypes for ethnicities?
Yeah, well, if I can start, this is, again, we go in a lot to race names and mixing, and one of the things I think to say right off the bat is social race is a chameleon. It changes its colors literally depending on what century you're in, which decade you're in, where you're located. And that's true of the census. The first US Census was in 1790. And ever since then, almost every decade, the race boxes have shifted. And they're political categories. And in fact, there's a document called the Office of Management and Budget, Directive 15, on the official race and ethnic categories in the US Census, and not just the US Census, but this is for health and housing and employment statistics and all of that stuff. And one of the things it says is that in small print is that these categories are neither scientific nor anthropological. So at that point you may say, well, what are they? Well, my view is it's better to have something, even though it's imprecise, than nothing. I mean, I do acknowledge that it's, for political purposes, but compared to a country like France that doesn't collect data by race, they can't track inequalities in wealth and health, et cetera, very well because they don't keep statistics. So I would almost say until racism is gone, we have to pay attention to race. So that's the main thing I really wanted to say. The question about ethnicity it again gets to sort of the complications of it, because we know what we now mostly call Latinx populations are, a large and growing important ethnicity in the United States. But because they're a mix of, they're seen to be mixed group of European, African, indigenous populations, it's hard to put them into an ethnicity. So you've got this complicated question of, if you are Latinx, then you kind of say, are you Latinx in Black? Are you Latinx in white, etc. So that's the one group that we hold out as, quote, an ethnicity, although it's an ethnicity that we kind of racialize. We think that there's something biological about it.
Yeah, and let me add to that, because that question goes to the very reason we wrote the book, because it stems from the ongoing confusion of biological conceptions of race and how they are measured, okay, having to do with the frequency of genes and phylogenetic tools to determine whether a group has a certain amount of gene flow with others, versus social definitions of race. What the census is measuring is how socially defined racialized individuals are being treated in a racist society. It is not measuring the frequency of genetic polymorphisms across groups of people in the United States. It's measuring our social institutions and how they impact racialized people. So of course we need to keep track of this. The census is a tool for sociological and political science research. It's not really an effective tool, although it does a little bit for us when we're looking at things like health disparity, because being racialized does have health impacts, very serious ones. But the way race is treated in biomedical research and clinical practice is just as confused as it's the way it's being treated in social science. So you should all be looking out for my perspective piece, which comes out in the New England Journal of Medicine, about the ongoing problems in education around human biological variation in medicine, which comes out on February 10th.
We will definitely look out for it. And we had a question specifically on health inequalities. So Denise asked, or says, that health inequalities are alive and well. Much of our public health infrastructure is built on racial categories. So how would you suggest removing those racial categories to really advance efforts to eliminate those health inequalities?
Okay, so if I can take this one, Alan, because I'm putting the reference to the New England piece. So I spent the last year working with my colleague, Dr. Andrea Dayrop of the Duke Department of Pathology, to do a thorough review of one of the most widely used textbooks in pathology in the world, Robbins' Basic Pathology, 10th edition. The 11th edition is now a whole lot, much better book than the 10th edition, because we removed all of the incorrect claims about human biological variation that are in that book. Now, generations of medical doctors have been trained from a false paradigm. And so, yeah, I mean, we need to do a complete revision of how medical clinicians and biomedical researchers view human biological variation. Now, yesterday, we met with the National Medical Board of Examiners with how these concepts are being used in licensing tests. And so there is now recognition that the 19th century racial categories do not reflect what human biological variation is, in the way I was talking about genetic variants associated with, for example, malaria resistance. Virtually every disease that occurs in humans occurs in all human populations, but at different frequencies. And in particular, in the United States, because of its colonial and chattel slavery history, persons of African descent are anywhere from 16 to 30% European in their ancestry. And again, we talk about all of this in the chapter on disease, race and disease, and life history and mortality. So in the end of the day, yes, we need a complete revision of how medicine and biomedical research thinks about human biological variation. I wrote an article about that in the American Journal of Human Biology in September. I'll put that in the chat. But there is a movement to get this stuff right.
Thank you, Joe. I would add that finally there's, I think, a scientific consensus that just saying that there's racial difference is not enough, that be it infant mortality, be it life expectancy, almost anything, because when we say that, we tend to assume, or have, because we live in a sort of age of genetics, assume it must be due to genetics. And, so the American Association of Biological Anthropologists has just a couple of years ago, released a statement on race and racism that I think is a really good consensus statement. Many medical journals are now revising their policy for how race is used, and some are being very explicit that they will no longer accept race as a genetic category. A lot of measurements that have, quote, race corrections are being done away with because those race corrections are shown to probably do more harm than good. I'll say one more thing is that almost one of the things that sort of underlies almost every analysis of a racial inequality of a complex trait, be it, for example, athletic performance or musical ability or intelligence or differences in disease rates, I think kind of fundamentally it rests on two errors. One is thinking that it's due to genetics, and because it's easy to pin things on genetics. It's something that does, we think, kind of stand still, versus life experience, which is extremely complex or subtle. Everyday racism is a very sort of complex thing to deal with. Plus, genetics, we can sort of wave our hands and say, okay, that's just the natural way. The second error, which I think is even more pernicious and incorrect, is thinking that if it's genetic, then somehow it's race-based genetics. And that's sort of the thing that I think we've really tried to heavily make sure that that's no longer a way of thinking. What's left over is then paying a little bit more attention to lived experience of growing up person of color versus white, et cetera, in this society. And I think that's where medicine is finally beginning to catch up, is understanding, places like social medicine and social epidemiology are really beginning to explore how growing up, that say poor white versus poor black is really very different experience.
And Dr. Graves, I see you're posting a bunch of articles here. So if you could email them to us, actually, I can send them out to the group for everyone because I can't quite copy it in real time. So I would appreciate that. Sure,
that's fine. I'll be happy to send you those. But this is something I've been working on since the mid '90s. I wrote my first article on race fallacies in medicine, and it's and I hate to say it, it took the public murder of George Floyd for medical societies to start taking me seriously, even though science was very clear.
Yeah, and I'll just add that that's the tip of the iceberg of racism.
Well, we have already 13 more questions coming in. I do just want to ask everybody for a little bit of patience. We have a lot of people on tonight, and so we have a lot of questions coming in. So we are going to try and get to as many as we can. We go until about 8 o'clock, so we still have over half an hour left. So we had a question come in, and I'm reading them. So if I say it wrong, please just write back in and let me know. But Tom Hafer says, will two Chinese ever beget a black child or vice versa? If not, how can the statement common categories like black, white, and Asian do not represent genetic differences among groups be true? If this claim is fallacious, how can anything built upon it be true?
All right, so I think that that's not really understanding what we are saying. It is absolutely true that there is geographically based genetic variation in the human species. We make that very plain. It's absolutely true, okay? That genetic variation is continuous, which means there is no unambiguous way to define which groups would be biological races based upon modern population genetic criteria. And those genetic criteria are the amount of genetic variation within groups versus the amount of genetic variation between groups, and whether any group within our species can be considered an evolutionarily unique lineage. And that has to do with the amount of gene flow that occurs between human populations. And if you look at the theories of gene flow, it takes a very small amount of gene flow to keep a species relatively uniform in its allele frequencies. Now, it's absolutely true that there is local genetic variation, which is associated with particular geographical places. Now, when you consider the physical features that are used to determine whether someone is, quote, Chinese, or whether someone is European, or whether someone is African, that is an incredibly small percentage of the 20,000 protein coding genes in the human genome. For example, skin color is determined by 5 major genetic factors and about 10 that contribute to modification in skin color. There are 20,000 genes. And so yes, 2 people of Han Chinese descent are likely to give birth to a child that looks like they're of Han Chinese descent. And 2 people in Nigeria are likely to give birth to a child that looks like they have Nigerian features. And 2 people in Sweden are likely to give birth to a child that looks like they're Swedish. That does not mean that we have biological races. It means that there is local genetic variation that gives humans the appearance of being different. But if we look at other polymorphisms, like whether you can digest lactose or not, okay, then you find that people in Northern Europe have lactase persistence alleles, but people in East Africa do too. If you, again, we go with malaria, same, you find malaria resistance genes all over the world. People in the Himalayas have genes that resist altitude, so do people in the Andes. The rainforest phenotype of short stature, which is found in Central Africans, is also found in South America in the Amazon. So yeah, if you want to cherry pick your phenotypes, like, oh, you know, there are different hairstyles, and yes, indeed, hair forms. People who have those hair forms are, you know, homozygous for those genes. They mate each other. The kids are going to have those hair forms. That does not mean we're biological races.
Can I add, Tom, your question, that was nice, really great, important answer from Joe. But I think fundamentally, I want to say that it's almost like your question assumes that races are giving birth to children, and you know that so 2 people are representing their race, which, as we said, is a sort of a social construct. It doesn't hold biological water. No, 2 parents are giving birth, quite literally, not their represented race, which, as people who've done 23andMe will know, that you know you can have very mixed ancestry. African Americans in the United States classically have, due to rapes, etc., have European ancestry. So the point is that a birth doesn't represent, has nothing to do with a race. It just simply is the mixing of one's parents' genes. And if they both are Han Chinese, then there's going to be, you know, that child does a 23andMe, they're probably going to come out as highly Han Chinese. And that's all there is to it.
Okay, we have just constant questions coming in, so I'm going to get through as many as I can. Emily Deach says, how do you grapple with the effect of constructed racial categories' impact on biological aspects that include everything from one's ability to have a healthy diet to access to healthcare? The healthcare numbers are now differential as a result of that legacy versus race being considered the core biological determinant, which is hard sometimes to explain to people unaware of the history.
You know, I'll start this one, Alan, if you don't mind. So yeah, that's one of the reasons we wrote this book, because we want to dispel the false notion that underlying genetic variation is responsible for the health disparity profiles that we see. And again, you have to have a little bit of sophistication in genetics to be able to understand this. But basically, to make things simple, all traits that we see, including health-related traits, are the combination of three major factors: genes, environment, and chance effects that occur during development. And one should not write off those chance effects because they can be quite significant. But for the most part, it has to do with environment and genetics. So since I've been doing this for a while, I've been writing about this for a while. And by the way, for folks that don't know, my experimental work is in complex genetic traits. I was one of the people who first showed that genes control aging. So I'm not, a sociologist who decided he wanted to write about race. Okay, as some people have tried to claim that I am. I'm actually, I received my fellow nomination and vote into AAAS on the basis of my pioneering work in the quantitative trait of aging. And so I understand how these things work. And as a result, when I began to look at, health disparities, it became really clear to me that the difference in allele frequencies with regard to risk variance for specific disease systems were not sufficient to account for the dramatic differences in health disparity. Let me give you one example. So, it's sort of known that, people of African descent in the Western world have elevated prevalences of hypertension. So back in the mid-2000s, I went into the biological literature and I began to look for genetic variants associated with hypertension. And there'd been, decades of research on this. And then I began to look at the frequency of protective variants against hypertension and risk variants for hypertension. And guess what I found? I found that Africans had higher frequency, African Americans had a higher frequency of the protective anti-hypertension variants than European Americans did. And therefore, by a simple genetic hypothesis, we would have predicted that European Americans should have had the elevated rates of hypertension, and that African Americans should have had less hypertension, but it's exact opposite. And let me demonstrate how even more ridiculous genetic explanations of health disparity are in the United States. So, again, about 4 or 5 years ago, using bioinformatic tools, researchers looked at the entire human genome by region, and here we continental region, and looked for genetic variants that should be deleterious. And you can do that by determining, what protein are they impacting and what amino acid is being changed. And we can model these protein structures and determine how they operate. So they did this. And when they looked at the genetic variants in, again, sub-Saharan Africans that are probably deleterious and definitely deleterious, and compared them to Europeans, this is what they found. They found that African Americans or Africans and Europeans for alleles which were probably deleterious had equal frequency. Okay, but for the variants that were definitely deleterious, Europeans had a higher frequency of those that were definitely deleterious compared to Africans who had a lower frequency of alleles that were definitely deleterious. And since most of these health conditions that we're talking about, the big ones, cardiovascular disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, all of this stuff, they're quantitative traits that are influenced by the entire genome. A genetic prediction would have Europeans displaying higher prevalences of all of these diseases and not African. But once again, we get the exact opposite result. And that in and of itself throws the genetic explanation for health disparity in the scrap heap of dead ideas. In other words, people who know genetics, and believe me, I know genetics, okay? We know that you can't explain human health disparity by the differences in frequency of genes. That it's a ridiculous program that only people who don't understand genetics advance, or people who have a specific racial agenda. And there are a lot of those people out there.
We had a couple of questions about sickle cell. So I'm not sure if these are initials or a name, but DAG or DAG asked about sickle cell. And then one of our former presidents of the ColumbiaDC Club, Lou Mendelson, asked, how do you explain diseases like Tay Sachs, primarily among Ashkenazi Jews, and then sickle cell among African Americans?
Yeah, Alan, you want to take Tay Sachs and sickle cell?
I'll take sickle cell,
And I'll do Tay Sachs.
Okay. Yeah, that we have few clearer stories of why race doesn't explain a genetic disease than sickle cell. And we know quite clearly, as I think Joe talked a little bit about this earlier on, about where sickle cell shows up and why it's been raced. Sickle cell has been thought to be a disease of Africanness. It's not at all. It's not a racial disease. Sickle cell shows up in about 5 different areas of the world: West Africa, circum-Mediterranean, Arabian Peninsula, India. Joe, it's the 5th one. But it shows up in areas where we have clearing of lands for agriculture, stagnant waters attracting mosquitoes that have the malaria parasite. And we know biologically, biochemically, that sickle cell, having one copy, is an adaptation to resist malaria. So it's an adaptation that occurs in certain parts of the world, only one of which is Africa, but that's an area in which a lot of enslaved Africans came to the United States. So as sickle cell was discovered, it was thought to be a disease of Africanness, and that's an error. Sickle cell is due to the unnatural history, I'll call it, because it's about culture, agriculture, clearing of lands, and is prevalent in, as I said, 5 different places in the world. It's not prevalent in North Africa, nor South Africa, nor even East Africa, just one zone of Africa. So sickle cell is all about, it's a really interesting evolutionary adaptation story, has nothing to do with race.
And just to give you a couple of concrete examples, the frequency of the sickle cell allele in Greece is higher than its frequency in African Americans. And the reason for that is that when enslaved Africans were brought to the United States, okay, initially, the conditions for malaria transmission occurred throughout the American South, and frequencies of sickle cell remained relatively the same as they were in West Africa. But once people began living indoors, once they had screen doors, once water projects were implemented to get rid of bodies of standing water, and malaria transmitting mosquitoes were eradicated throughout the American South, the frequency of sickle cell anemia began to drop because heterozygotes no longer conferred any evolutionary advantage. And so when the ancestral populations of African Americans had frequencies of around 20%, now African Americans have frequencies of less than 8%. And that's because the heterozygote condition no longer carries an evolutionary advantage. Now, talking about Tay Sachs. So Tay Sachs is a disease that's found circum-Mediterranean. And, because it's not a beneficial disease, it can differ in specific groups by genetic drift, which is simple, blind, dumb, bad luck. Now, in the 90s in the United States, a lot of Jewish communities began to do marriage counseling around Tay Sachs. And for a while, it was extremely effective and dramatically reduced the frequency of Tay Sachs in Jewish Americans, such that it was equivalent to that of other persons of European descent. Now those efforts, have sort of gone away, and the frequencies are beginning to increase again. So, and the other point that Alan and I consistently try to make is that you cannot take one genetic system that differs in frequency in groups of people around the world and use that as a basis of trying to define racial groups. That's absolutely wrong. Okay, human beings differ in frequency at a number. We have 20,000 protein coding genes. Why would we claim that Tay Sachs or sickle cell is the one that we should use to classify people into races? If we chose another trait like high altitude and low altitude, we've never, ever heard people persecuted because they were a high altitude adaptation. It's never happened. Okay, so these things are socially defined and constructed around the oppression of human beings. And one way to justify the oppression of human beings is to make them less, to make them diseased and sick. And so in the United States, sickle cell was used in the American South as a way of enforcing anti-miscegenation laws. Okay, and in Europe, beginning in the 8th, 9th century, all sorts of crazy claims were made about Jews having all these strange diseases, and men who menstruated and having tails, and all sorts of other absolute falseness to other them and to keep people away from them.
That's really interesting. I hope that answered some of those questions. I had no idea. Ronnie has a question speaking of how divided the conversation around race can get, saying that at the beginning of tonight's conversation, he spoke about race related to the Irish, the Italians, and the Jews, kind of mixing nationality and religion. How does all of this relate? And then bringing it kind of into current news stories, Ronnie says, what is critical race theory? As per the political categories, is the concept of race merely used to divide us?
Maybe I'll say something quickly, and then I'm gonna cede to Joe, because I know he's been thinking a lot about critical race theory, or the kerfuffle, the false kerfuffle around it. I think a lot of people have the trope that if you speak about race, you're bringing race up, then somehow you're reifying race, or you're trying to divide us. I mean, that's a typical Republican strategy, as if we weren't divided already, as if we didn't have glaring inequalities in wealth and health. And so it's like blaming the victim for bringing up, hey, something's going on here. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, what are you're trying to divide us up? You please, let's just ignore, let's just be post-racial. No, that's kind of BS. That as we said, we can't get beyond race until we get rid of racial inequalities.
Yeah, so it turns out that the subject of my next book is going to be critical race theory. And people don't even begin to understand what it is. And certainly those who are attacking it have really no idea what they're talking about. So for those of you who are familiar with the history of philosophy, critical theory was an idea that theories about social processes should be designed to end human oppression. It was a very common idea in I think it was forgot the name of the school, but it was associated with a city in Germany.
Frankfurt School.
Frankfurt School, yeah, the Frankfurt School, and some very heady and famous people like I think Herbert Marcuse, the French philosopher,
Horkheimer, Adorno,
yeah, were associated with this way of thinking. Now, critical race theory is just one application of critical theory, because critical theory has been applied to class structure, it's been applied to patriarchy and has been applied to racial oppression. And so when Derek Bell in the 1970s began to look at the progress that wasn't being made after the civil rights movement had concluded, he began to come up with a theory of the way race operated in the United States. And the theory was based pretty much on a couple of premises. The first premise was that biological races weren't real, they were socially constructed. Well, certainly Alan and I agree with that, because we just wrote a book demonstrating how biological races aren't real, they're socially constructed. And the second point of critical race theory is that virtually every institution in American society is influenced by structural racism. In other words, politics, economics, education, and so forth. Every institution has elements of structural racism in it. And so that's really what critical race theory is saying. And critical race theorists are people who are trying to understand how structural racism operates in different venues within our society. Now, no one teaches critical race theory in American public schools. If you look at the state social science and history standards across the nation, nobody teaches critical race theory. So to attack something as a problem in the schooling of American youth that simply doesn't exist is a red herring. Critical race theory isn't even predominantly taught in the American university system. There are some CRT scholars here and there, but for the most part, in Ivy League schools, in state research universities, sort of the standard Eurocentric model of American history, economics, philosophy is dominant. So CRT isn't taking over the country, and it's highly unlikely that it ever will. So when Donald Trump, gave his first public speech after the Capitol insurrection of January 6, 2021, he hit on critical race theory, I think 8 or 9 times, and tried to create a rallying cry for his supporters. So what I liken the attack on CRT to is in 1933, the Reichstag burned down. Now, historians believe that the Nazis set the fire. We don't have definite proof of that, but it explains a lot, because after the Reichstag burns down, the Nazis claim that the nation is in crisis. Hindenburg turns over the keys to the car to Adolf Hitler. So the attack on critical race theory in 2022 is our Reichstag fire. The Republican Party is trying to use it as a way to justify normalizing principles of white supremacy in their political platform. It's really that simple.
Well, maybe one more question kind of on issues in the news right now, a little bit more on the sports side here. Somebody says, what are your thoughts on the Brian Flores, who's the former head coach of the Miami Dolphins? And there's a lawsuit versus the NFL where he alleges that there's been blatant discrimination against hiring Black coaches.
That sounds like what we've been talking about all night, Alan.
Yeah, I thought you were going to ask about Tom Brady, but I just am trying to catch up on the Black Brian Flores. So I don't know, Joe, if you're.
I followed this story, and he's absolutely right. I mean, there is blatant racial discrimination in the hiring of coaches in the NFL. Now, I partially know this from some personal experience, because my cousin's husband is an African-American coach who coached in the NFL. And having conversations with him, he relayed all of the examples of structural racism that owners, hold with regard to how they make decisions in terms of hiring coaches. I mean, how can you have a league where for the last couple of decades, 70% of the players have been African Americans? And only there of 26 teams in the NFL, only one African-American coach. Brian Flores had 2 seasons in Miami, both winning seasons. Okay, they were within a couple of games of making the playoffs this year. How do you fire a coach who had 2 winning seasons when he joined a team that had losing seasons and has 2 winning seasons in a row, almost makes the playoff? And by the way, Miami dealt with all sorts of difficulties, including injuries to their star quarterback and all. How do you fire this guy? You can't come up with a justification. And of course, in the interviews that he has given, like the one on ESPN this morning, where someone texted him before his interview with the New York Giants, congratulating him for having the job. And the error was that they text the wrong Brian. So he's about to go in an interview for a job that they've already decided to give to another candidate. He talked about the situation in Denver, where he goes to do an interview in Denver and John Elway comes to the interview drunk. Clearly he had been up all night partying. So, who gives it, and they're late, by the way. So who gives an interview to a candidate after partying all night and being drunk, and you're taking that candidate seriously? And so, the stories that African-American athletes give of the way we have been treated, and I used to be an athlete too, the way we've been treated in sports, again, is completely consistent with this racist nonsense that is driving every other aspect of structural racism in the United States. And I think that, one other example, the NFL's concussion protocols, where they judged African-American athletes by a different standard of mental ability. And they claimed that because African-American mental ability was lower than that of European-American, that these players who had clearly suffered, brain trauma were in fact not eligible for benefits. And again, they only changed this policy this year in 2021. So why are we surprised that they won't hire Black coaches? Not to mention the Redskins, right? I mean, come on.
I missed the announcement today. Did they end up being the Commanders? Is that the new name?
Yeah, the Commanders, but the notion that the Redskins, that this country would tolerate a racist epithet like Redskins in the nation's capital for, when did the Redskins come into the league? I mean, they're one of the original NFL franchises, so for a very long time. And for those of you in the Washington area, I'm sure they were the last NFL franchise to draft a Black player.
All right. Well, a little bit more on topic now for our event tonight. We have a question here saying that there was an article in New Scientist that said that the father of all men is 340,000 years old. One man carries a Y chromosome so distinctive that it reveals new information about the origin of our species. What does this mean given tonight's discussion?
Well, I haven't read the New Scientist piece, but I will. And the last paper that I have on Y chromosomes shows that original Y chromosome was African. So I don't know if this is a new Y chromosome analysis that finds a non-African one, but I truly doubt it, considering that all mitochondrial genes, which are inherited mother to daughter, can coalesce back to Africa. All of our autosomal genes coalesce back to Africa, and Y chromosomes coalesce back to Africa. So if there's a new chromosome that's been found that's older than the estimate of 300,000, because this has got to be a computational study, because there's no 300,000-year-old ancient DNA. That's not possible. So it's a computational analysis that's doing a coalescence back to the origin of this Y chromosome lineage. So, and I'm absolutely sure it's African. And again, the point we make is that 340,000, that's now the new date for anatomically modern humans, 340,000 years. The first 240,000 of those years were spent in Africa before anyone left. And when people began to leave, they were leaving in small groups. Okay, and so therefore genetic drift plays a major role in determining allele frequencies around the world. And by the way, it still does. The major determinant of gene frequency is genetic drift, not natural selection. And it's a continuous drop in genetic diversity from East Africa to the rest of the world.
Yeah, I will just say I haven't had a chance to read the article, but as Joe says, I don't think it disrupts much of anything. It may provide some specification that I would love to see repeated in another analysis pointing to that Y chromosome, but it just seems to confirm, other sources of data or, kind of provide some other, kind of just other line of evidence that supports what I think we've already known.
Okay, maybe we can get to a couple more here in our last few minutes. Julia Silva asks, how can we help separate race and socioeconomic status?
I mean, I'll jump in and say that, yeah, it's a really good question. And there's clearly a difference in socioeconomic status by race. And I think one way to think about this is a long time ago, somebody that I really admire, Vicente Navarro, wrote an article that I think was titled Race or Class, or Race and Class. And it was an analysis of heart disease. And what he made the point is that both of them are risk factors, that social race and low socioeconomic status are both risk factors or, associated with higher rates of heart disease. So I think we need to continue to study them separately and also study the intersections of socioeconomic status and race. And on some things, socioeconomic status turns out to maybe be more powerful. Some data right now suggests that life expectancy is maybe even more related to education and measures of socioeconomic status than it is to race, but it's also, low socioeconomic status of whites, you have a greater life expectancy than low socioeconomic status of people of color, same with high socioeconomic status. So there's a racial dimension to both. Last thing I'll say is that I think we have to get over the fact that the experience of being poor white is something we need to pay attention to, but it's not the same as the experience of being poor and of color. There's absolutely a different lived experience, a different reality, a different burden. And so it's race and class.
Yeah, and let's talk about class and how class was created in the United States. So just put in the chat the figure of the value of unpaid labor to enslaved African Americans from 1776 to 1860. And this was $18.5 quadrillion. Now, this was calculated based upon wages at the time, population size, using 3% interest over this time period, and you come to $18.5 quadrillion. Now, on top of that, when African Americans emerged from slavery, okay, the southern states reenacted the Jim Crow laws, black codes, that prevented African Americans from going into certain professions, prevented them from acquiring land, a whole bunch of other things. Like, my mom, for example, was born as a sharecropper. Okay, so the ability to accumulate wealth and even in things like the New Deal differentially benefited persons of European descent. the Southern Democrats fought against including agricultural labor and domestic labor in the New Deal, because they knew the vast majority of African Americans were employed in those sectors at that time. So there's been consistent structural things which mitigated against African Americans being educated, gaining, wealth. And so that now in 2022, the median value of wealth for European American families is 10 times that of African Americans. And that's a median. There are places where the gap is much, much bigger. And by the way, the places where the gap is much, much bigger can be directly tied to the regions that had the most formerly enslaved people there. So in the United States, race and class are closely tied together because the economic system, capitalism, which brought some 44 to 18.5 million people to the Western Hemisphere, okay, was using that labor to get itself started, but for the differential benefit of persons of European descent. So you can't separate the two in this society.
All right, we are just about at the end of time. So if I could ask you to do two things for us as we finish out tonight. One, I will send out the link to the book tomorrow. We are recording this event, so we'll send out the link to the recording as well as the link to the book, and then any of the articles that you want to share, we can send those as well. But if there's any other authors or podcasts or specific things that you suggest people who are interested, where can they go to learn more information about tonight's topic? And then if you both have any closing thoughts in our last 4 minutes.
Alan, you want to go first? Or you want me to go first?
Please go.
Well, the first thing I recommend is read our book. And it's not just because we want to sell books, okay? Because we put a lot of work, scholarly work into this book to turn it into a tool to help people who want to make our society a more just and equitable place. And from my perspective, this is something we must absolutely do, okay? Because injustice is not sustainable. Okay? It interferes with our ability to deal with existential problems, meaning the existence of our species on this planet is placed in danger by racism and the associated fascist ideologies that feed on racism. For example, the COVID 2019 pandemic is a perfect example of how racist ideology played a role in costing the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. So read our book. It has plenty of references. One of the things we did is we abundantly referenced this book, and it will lead you to all of the other literature that we're not experts in. So yeah, please read our book.
Thank you, Joe. I'll do two quick shout outs. I happen to be a fan of a podcast called Speaking of Race that is in its 4th season. Joe and I just did an interview. It hasn't been downloaded, it hasn't been done yet with them, but they've gone through lots of history of the idea of race. And Joe and I were also part of, I think, the best documentary that's ever been out there called Race, the Power of an Illusion. The documentary is good. It's a little bit dated. There's a new website that is up at University of California, Berkeley, that I think is quite good. Has lots of resources, as does understandingrace.org, which is part of the AAA project that I run. But I'll end with our book and say that, people have said, do we need yet another book on race and racism? And I think ours is unique in a couple ways. One is, it's written by 2 scientists who are very data driven and stick closely to the data. And I think the question and answer format makes it really accessible. So not trying to sell books, but we think we have an important book out there.
All right, well, thank you both again so much for tonight. We had a lot of questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to all of them, so we had a lively discussion. Thank you both again. We'll send out all of the information tomorrow, and everyone have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.